We've had a large amount of new debt created just in the last few months because the Fed's been there to buy it, and because rates are now back at zero, which makes it very cheap to continue to borrow. That creates this bigger snowball effect going forward, and that creates a situation where we are more ripe for a larger financial crisis than we've seen so far. So bigger than the financial crisis of 2008, bigger than what the coronavirus pandemic has unleashed. I think right now silver actually is expanding in terms of its appeal, and it goes through cycles. So it's not like the first time, but particularly right now, where the better way to invest in it is not to sort of worry about the squeeze per se or what's going on the financial basis, but to literally buy silver. Like literally people want to invest, buy physical silver coins.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. I'm Reluctant Preppers. We have a first-time guest today. Nomi Prins is an author, expert in investigative journalist, and a geopolitical financial expert. She's written the books Other People's Money, The Corporate Mugging of America, All the President's Bankers, and Collusion, How Central Bankers Rigged the World. She's going to be speaking at the upcoming Sprott Natural Resources Symposium, the virtual symposium. Nomi, thank you for joining us this first time, Friday, July 10th, 2020.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me join you.
We've been asking for some time if we could get you on, and this was finally the perfect opportunity because as you're going to be speaking at the Sprott conference on the main stage, you're going to be bringing a message coming out of your years in the financial industry and your blistering critiques of it in recent years through the books that you've published. We wonder if you could take a few minutes just to give our audience a taste of the topic, the theme that you're going to be addressing at the Sprott conference so that they may understand where you're going to be coming from and how they can take advantage of that.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to do that. I really appreciate it. I'm going to focus on kind of the similarities and the differences between this particular crisis, the coronavirus pandemic crisis, relative to the financial crisis of 2008, and how this particular time around, there's been an even more massive infusion of quantitative easing, of all sorts of Federal Reserve facilities, and the ability of the Fed to basically buy any form of security from the market, which has kind of created a disconnect, which I call actually a permanent distortion, between the market, financial assets, and the real economy. What people are doing, what they're facing in terms of job losses, small business losses, how they might have to retool businesses that could reopen in a different way, and a lot of uncertainty from an economic standpoint. So I'm looking really at that disconnect. And from the standpoint of what that means to Sprott participants potentially with respect to where they're positioned and what that could mean for current investment opportunities, I also do focus on things like our savings rate right now in banks being up around 33% versus 8% in February. And there's a lot of money there out of fear and also out of the fact that people aren't able to go out and purchase things. But there are questions, therefore, as to how to make that money both be preserved and also make it grow. And so one of the things I talk about are why gold and silver in this particular environment actually work given that scenario and given how the Fed's kind of on steroids scenario. So I talk about sort of all of that, and I also talk about squirrels, and I'll explain that.
Now, I have to key off of one word that you just mentioned. You mentioned the savings rate. Can you first clarify to people what that statistic actually represents? But I have a follow-up question once you tell us what the savings rate actually means.
Yeah, so what that is that's the savings rate in terms of the growth in savings deposit accounts to the in the major banks in the country. So the FDIC keeps records, as do other sorts of bureaus, of the actual increase in the size of those accounts. And so based on the increase in the size of those accounts, they make kind of assessments as to what the general savings rate is of Americans, and they compare it. They do it on a monthly basis, as they do a lot of data that they get from banks, and so they can compare it relative to other months. And obviously we had a spike. There was a lot of reasons for that spike, and it might come down, but it still means that people, for different reasons, as I mentioned, and I'll get into more detail in my talk, actually have kind of kept their money, out of the market, out of their own personal economies, for, again, different reasons, and that it's sort of there for individuals and also for a lot of financial firms and asset managers as well. There's been a lot of the kind of retraction.
Right. I remember Alistair MacLeod, when we have him on, he talks about businesses drawing in their horns.
Right.
Now, in that regard, though, the word savings can be a real misleading misnomer given the rule changes that were made following the great financial collapse or crisis in 2009 timeframe, where people like us who grew up being told that money you put in the bank is good as in the bank is savings. Can you clarify to people that what they call savings, or what we call savings accounts, is not in fact, first of all, it's not their money anymore once it's in there, but what they're actually doing with their funds?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because again, that savings rate is very much a mathematical rate in terms of the money that people keep or institutions keep in these savings deposit accounts in banks. Now, banks utilize these accounts for leveraging their activity. So in order for them to make loans, they basically look at the amount of deposits that they have in checking accounts and savings accounts, and based on that, they sort of go off and leverage those accounts, use them as collateral, basically, in order to go and make loans wherever it is they decide to make loans. And disproportionately, that tends to be to the larger businesses versus the small businesses, or so entrepreneurship businesses, or even personal loans. So that's just kind of how it goes down in terms of that. But the other reason I think savings is kind of a misnomer is because what it used to mean is that you would put money aside, let's say in an account at your bank, and that money would, to an extent, grow with inflation, so that you would get an interest rate on that money. And on average, it's been 6% in the past. Now it's like 0. But back in the day, there was a sense that you could actually save money and it would appreciate in that sort of manner. So it would be there, it would appreciate. Now that kind of doesn't happen. So that money that's kind of been added into savings accounts that exist really isn't gaining anything. It's just kind of there for individuals and small businesses and institutions that have it there. But banks, on the other hand, can use it for their purposes as collateral for any activity they really do.
Yeah, and the understanding we've been given is that it's not even yours anymore. You're now an unsecured creditor of the bank, because as they're using it for whatever purposes they want, you don't necessarily mean you're going to get it back.
That's right.
We have a question from H. Paul Fuchs, who says, what do you think of Alistair MacLeod's prediction on our channel earlier this week that we will have a full-blown banking crisis perhaps as early as this month, and a currency crisis yet this year, and that it'll end the ability of the Fed to control that? Are you seeing as dire and as urgent outcomes in the cards, or do you think that there'll be a different timeline?
I do think we're going to have another financial crisis. I don't think it's this month per se. There might be a detraction from the stock market at some point, and to the extent that people view that as some indicator of financial health, which it isn't necessarily, but to the extent that's an indicator, there could be more money retracted from the stock market if things, for example, happen like many more cases happen, more sort of economic facilities that have reopened, shut down, and various other things like that. And the banks realize that they're seeing a lot more bankruptcies on the credit that they've extended to corporations or to individuals or small businesses and so forth, and that could hurt the banking system. The other thing that can hurt the banking system is the fact that the Fed's been supporting the banking system. It supported the banking system since the financial crisis, well, before that, but in epic ways since the financial crisis of 2008, with all its facilities, with cheap money, with buying the securities that the banks kind of wanted to get rid of in the form of QE and keeping it on their books. And a lot of that allowed banks to look like they were doing better than they actually were. Why? Because they had all this money coming in from the Fed for securities they didn't even want. That allowed them to mark the securities they still had higher than they were actually worth. And that kind of had a snowball sort of artificial effect in making their balance sheets ultimately look better. And that was kind of rubber stamped throughout the year since the financial crisis by the people that ran the Federal Reserve. So by Ben Bernanke, by Janet Yellen, and now by Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, who effectively said that into this particular crisis, the banks were doing okay. He still says that. He still says that even with the Fed having almost doubled the size of its balance sheet from $3.7 trillion last August, which was kind of a decline of their balance sheet from its high of $4.5 trillion, up to $4.1 trillion by the end of 2019, because they opened something called repo operations or short-term lending, which was the bank's job, but they were doing it for the banks. Because even with all of this liquidity, the top 4 banks in this country have about $4 trillion worth of deposits, and they still had to have the Fed help them. And then the Fed says they're healthy. And then, the pandemic happens, and the Fed is still saying, well, they would be healthy except for this. And it's like, no, they actually were not. They looked healthier than they were because you helped them, i.e. the Fed helped them. And then they took stress tests that didn't even remotely cover the potential for any form of a segmentation of the economy closing or unemployment going to the levels that we saw in as a tight, period of time. And okay, they might not have known there was going to be a pandemic, but stress tests are stress tests. You are supposed to stress, crazy crisis scenarios, and they were kind of softballing it. But the Fed said that was okay, and the Fed still says they would have been okay. What? So I don't think they're healthy. I didn't think they were healthy then. I think that one of the reasons they appear healthier is because they've had a stupendous amount of help, really, and this is where we are now. I don't know that they have a crisis in a month from now. I do think there's going to be a period where, because of what the Fed has done now on steroids, grown its balance sheet, buying everything it can, including individual corporate bonds, helping the banks in that manner, because these corporations owe money to the banks, and they also take out new debt from the banks. We've had a large amount of new debt created just in the last few months because the Fed's been there to buy it, and because rates are now back at zero, which makes it very cheap to continue to borrow. That creates this bigger snowball effect going forward. And that creates a situation where we are more ripe for a larger financial crisis than we've seen so far. So bigger than the financial crisis of 2008, bigger than what the coronavirus pandemic has unleashed, because we're now at an even higher height of debt and subsidy and artificial market expansion relative to the real economy. So relative to what actual people do and need in their own lives and in the lives of small businesses and their localities and communities and so forth, at the foundation of the whole economy. I don't know when that will happen. Again, I don't think that's a month from now. But I do think that we're looking at somewhere within the next year or two. And I say that because connecting to all of that, and I'm not a doctor, I don't really know, but it seems to me that if we continue to have uncertainty in openings and reclosings of an economy until, for example, there's a vaccination available globally, not just the U.S. economy, but on a global perspective, that could add that additional uncertainty into the equation, which could perpetuate the possibility of a crisis. Now, the Fed's going to try to be there. The Fed may not be able to control a crisis, but what the Fed does is it increases its balance sheet. Right now, it's at $7 trillion. I think it could go up to $10 trillion, and I think that can happen if we start to see these sort of crisis factors pop up more quickly. And the Fed's basically said that. When they use terms like no limit, that's what they actually mean. Like, I take that at face value.
That's what I was going to follow up when you said you could see the Fed's balance sheet rising to $10 trillion. It's like, at what point would the dynamic change then? Because the economy, the real economy itself, as you're pointing out, is fraught with uncertainty. The supply chains are heavily broken down in different places and stressed. Millions and tens of millions of people out of work just in the U.S. alone. Lots of defaults on personal mortgages, on commercial mortgages. I mean, isn't this more like you've called it a snowball? You called it when you appeared on Greg Hunter's USA Watchdog. You talked about this massive snowball rolling down the hill towards Main Street USA. It sounds like we're going to get flattened at Main Street unless something changes. And I haven't heard you describe any of these dynamics like causing a turnaround or causing something to fundamentally change back towards a healthy pattern.
Well, there isn't a current dynamic. That's the problem. We can create a dynamic, i.e., I can envision a dynamic that could help with an actual recovery, but that requires sort of capital spent for people and small businesses and medium businesses, basically a ground up type of a consolidation of people's personal finances in this very uncertain time. I think it requires a retooling of a lot of businesses. I mean, you and I are having this conversation over Skype. I'm sure you and I know I have had lots of Zoom conversations and different forms of sort of expanding the technological communication, because we can do that. I think technology is going to, not just in the communication space, but potentially in other spaces, be something that grows in the medical space, in the hospital, data kind of efficiency space. There could be ways in which there is growth in areas that haven't hired as much in the past, and people can potentially be educated or retooled for that type of vision and for those types of just changing not just what's needed because of the virus, but what the trends are that it has opened up that might have been there already, but that now could accelerate. So yeah, we can have recoveries, but it does require ultimately more money being spent on both physical and technological infrastructure, and that means also more hiring and more retooling and re-educating, or educating for a start, depending on where people are in the workforce, their career lives, for this new world. So I could see that. That would be truly, great. But I think right now, the vision's much smaller than that. It's sort of feeding money into the financial world, into sort of financial assets, the markets, debt, and so forth. Yes, there's been some put aside for PPP loans and unemployment insurance coverage and those things, but those are more temporary. They're necessary but temporary. And I think because of those two things, there hasn't been a lot of thought towards a more strategic, what do we want to look like as an economy here in the U.S. I think we've done that less, and I think other countries are having to also though grapple with those questions now.
You are, again, the author of All the President's Bankers, and there's a question related to that from Yusuf Yat. It says, everyone talks about the big banks as a monolith, but is there any love lost between Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan? Bringing it up since the Trump administration seems heavily Goldman, and JP Morgan, according to several analysts we've had on our show, may be facing a silver short squeeze.
I think the whole idea of the monolith is that the larger banks do want the same things as a set of larger banks. They want fewer regulations. They want the ability to leverage more of what they have. They want the ability to invest in things that are way more speculative than they potentially should, given that they have insurance, deposit insurance for a lot of the individuals that contribute capital to their balance sheets. And so they all don't want that. They all do not want restrictions. And so in that manner, they are a monolith. In the manner that how capital moves through them to other parts of the financial community, to hedge funds, to private equity funds, how some of them have large asset management arms that also kind of dictate or at least influence where money goes from just a portfolio perspective. They are a monolith. Now, they also compete with each other within that monolith. So Goldman Sachs would definitely say compete with JP Morgan for a merger and acquisition deal with a major large client that might have a relationship with both of them. So there's definitely competition as well, and there's definitely personality issues between these institutions where it's like, I'm a Goldman Sachs person, I'm a JP Morgan person, those Bank of America people, they're just bankers, they're not investment bankers, they're not as smart, all these sort of things happen on a sort of competitive type A personality and type A corporation basis. But they are a monolith in that they ultimately, particularly today, do require and want and demand the same things. In terms of who they support politically and which parties and which presidents, they're pretty good at getting on both sides. So it doesn't really matter. And that's one of the themes of All the President's Bankers. It doesn't really matter where that money's coming from or so forth. Now, with respect to silver and a silver squeeze, that's been something that has been discussed for years now. I know a few years back, for example, because of the ETFs in silver, there was issues of whether or not there was a squeeze because and JP Morgan was considered to be the center of that potentially. because of trying to sort of jack up the price of silver, but not necessarily have it delivered into the contracts, ETF, and so forth. I think right now silver actually is expanding in terms of its appeal, and it goes through cycles. So it's not like the first time, but particularly right now, where the better way to invest in it is not to sort of worry about the squeeze per se or what's going on the financial basis, but to literally buy silver. Like literally, people want to invest, buy physical silver coins, or whatever it is your amount of money that you put aside to do that. Provides whatever avenue that provides you.
Well, we're looking forward to hearing your full address at the Sprott Virtual Natural Resource Symposium. And just thought if you wanted to leave any contact info now with our viewers so they can follow up and find out more about your work before that conference.
Oh, sure. So anybody can go and check out my website, which is www.nomiprins. That's NOMIPRINS.com. And it has my books, and it has my pieces and places I've appeared in the media. And it also has a running live feed for my social media, mostly Twitter account, which is at Nomi Prins. So you can join me on Twitter as well. I have a Nomi Prins Facebook page as well. But the live stuff tends to be quicker on Twitter. So that's a place. And if you don't add yourself onto my Twitter feed, then you can see that Twitter feed moving on my website.
Very good. We'll put those links in our description of this video, and we'll look for you at the Sprott Conference. Nomi Prins, thank you for joining us this first time on Liberty and Finance.
Thanks so much.
If you've decided that now is the right time for you to protect your family's financial future by acquiring physical precious metals, gold and silver, I'm delighted to let you know that I have now become a licensed dealer's representative for Miles Franklin, one of the oldest and most trusted names in bullion dealerships. And we can provide you with physical delivery to your personal possession or to professional vault storage or precious metals IRAs. Just email me at LibertyAndFinance@protonmail.com, and please include your name and phone number in your email to LibertyAndFinance@protonmail.com. We'll get right back with you and find out how to best meet your needs so that you can either begin or increase your acquisition of physical precious metals now and protect your family's future starting today.